1 out of 3 adults experience some form of mistreatment by their parents or caretakers in their childhood. And if you clicked on this video, you may be one of them. But as children, we didn't understand that our parents did mistakes. As children, we thought it's our fault that we got mistreated. We concluded that we are wrong if we get neglected, abused, or abandoned as a child. Today's episode is a reminder to wake up from that illusion that we internalized for years and decades. And today you will understand that it wasn't your fault that you were neglected, abused, or abandoned. And you will truly feel that you are beautiful the way you are, and you will learn how to break free from all the burden you might carry today. So make yourself comfortable for this episode, because I think this reminder might be super helpful to listen to. So welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and before I start today's episode with some personal thoughts, I just want to remind you that you can listen to this podcast episode on your favorite podcast platform as well, whether it be Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or of course here on YouTube. Today, I want to start again with some personal challenges I have to deal as an adult from time to time. And maybe you share some of these aspects of it as well. So if you want to share your story, definitely let me know in the comments below. Always appreciated also by other people who face similar challenges. Since I personally remember, in relationships I always had one major problem, and that is to communicate my true inner needs, my true inner desires, also my emotions, and to set clear boundaries. I wasn't always aware of that problem, but since I was digging deeper and trying to understand why I sometimes face somatic symptoms, different challenges, psychological challenges, I tend to understand more what was going on within myself. And I found out that the closer and the more intimate the relationship would be, the bigger those challenges and symptoms would be for me. Maybe that is also true for you. Practically, I feel a lot of guilt when I set a boundary because I'm afraid to push the other person away. And same is true for me when I communicate emotions, when I communicate my needs. What do I usually do? And I did that unconsciously for years. Now I'm trying to break free from that and understand that on a deeper level. But what technically happened to me is that I mask some of my emotions, specifically weak emotions. And I also mask and suppress specific needs, especially within close relationships. And those things are most of the times not any big desires or needs I have, but it's an accumulation of the small, tiny needs. For example, relaxation needs. For example, the need to go for a quick walk, the need to grab myself my favorite foods. Those tiny needs I might suppress because I feel that the other person would judge me. Maybe you can relate to that. If you're having a hard time saying no to your friends, to your family members within your intimate relationships, maybe you're also in your head then, and you think that those people might judge you for doing the things you need and want, or might hate you even for doing these things. Now, because of this behavior, because I do suppress, for example, these tiny needs and they accumulate, I can't really relax within my relationships. And what happens then is the more I keep that mask, the more I'm hiding, the more I'm suppressing, the more symptoms I would get and the more triggered I would feel. And therefore I need to withdraw because I do not feel safe anymore around my closest and beloved ones. So I tell them that I need space for myself for some time to withdraw from these people, to re-regulate myself again. But again, what happens? Even that is difficult to me because again, well, now I have that need that I need to withdraw because I can't meet my other needs. Then I feel guilty again because I have this need because I didn't meet my other needs. What happens again if I suppress even that need? It builds up more and more tension within myself because I'm constantly in this downward spiral of not meeting my needs, and I can't even withdraw because I feel guilty if I would withdraw. And then there's this toxic shame writhing within my head. Am I just so weird that I need that? Will the other person ever understand that? That's in my head then. I lose contact with myself, with my needs, with my inner sense. And what I learned so far about these and similar experiences from other people out there, because I know many of you share these things, is that they have their origin most of the times in past experiences, often in childhood wounds. And this is why I'm telling you this story, because if you have been neglected, abused, or abandoned, for example, as a child, you might also deal with similar challenges. In particular, when a child is neglected, abused, or abandoned, it will learn that there is something wrong with them, and that is what we label as a wound, and the wound, which in our central nervous system is a trauma, a complex childhood trauma. Now, that is exactly the definition of a complex childhood trauma. A trauma is Greek from wound, and it's not the events that happen to you, it is the wound that these events caused inside you. In many cases, those wounds lead to trauma-related symptoms later in life, the things I told you, for example, in the first story. And many people experience these things because they happen unconsciously to themselves, and they can't break free from them because they do not understand them, especially in those situations as they happen to them. When I wrote this first part for this episode, I was partly within those unconscious pattern, and I didn't understand what was going on within them. But now, couple days later, when I read through these things, I totally understand why they happened to me. Because those programs, they're deeply installed within the unconscious and then run my perception and state. But what that also shows is, quick side note here, that the brain just partly works. Obviously, the rational part of the brain is obviously deactivated in such states. So you just feel like you're in that tunnel. You're just at the mercy of these symptoms, and you are not able to switch back to the working state of the brain to feel safe and use your clear mind to solve that state. So when we talk about trauma here, many people would say, and I know that trauma, I'm not traumatized because my childhood was good, my childhood was great, and I didn't experience any horrible things. Yeah, I was neglected, abused, or abandoned from time to time, but overall my childhood was fine. Well, that may be true, and I always have believed that as well. But there is one fundamental misunderstanding about trauma here, and that is that trauma obviously happens intentionally and unintentionally, and trauma is created by your perception of reality. If you perceived experiences as traumatic as a child or as an adult, then this is your perception which will make up your reality, regardless of how bad or unproblematic they seemed from the outside. Do you understand that? For example, if you were very ill as a child and had to stay in hospital for a long time because of your health, the fact that the doctors kept you there can already be perceived as traumatic, even though the doctors only had your best interests at heart. Now, your perception is creating your reality. That's so important to understand. And if your perception of things, and that's especially true for highly sensitive people, that's especially true for neurodivergent people who have autism, Asperger's, ADHD or similar, those people are sensitive to their heart, and those people perceive things other people would consider as unproblematic, as traumatic, as severe. If you have experienced a difficult childhood where you have been neglected, abused, or abandoned, then consequences of that could be drastically within your adulthood. Some people might have psychological challenges to deal with within relationships, might have somatic symptoms, but childhood trauma can also lead to more severe physical conditions and diseases. For example, in 1998, the Adverse Childhood Experience so-called ACE study has been made public, and those study tried to identify correlations between people who had been mistreated as children and later arising conditions and diseases in their lives. And what they found is that trauma is not just about psychological symptoms, but also leads to other conditions and diseases. For example, people who experienced more than 4 adverse childhood experiences had twice a risk to develop a coronary heart disease and 1.9 times higher risk to develop any form of cancer, had also higher risk for lung diseases, diabetes, or stroke. And I think this really emphasizes how important it is to understand the connection between childhood mistreatment or a difficult, severe childhood experience from the child's perspective and the outcome later in life. And it also underlines how important it is to take care of yourself now as an adult. I also want to deep dive a bit more into different forms of childhood mistreatment because there are so many examples. Maybe you identify with some of them, maybe you identify with all of them. So how children learn that there is something wrong with them in a toxic family system and home really depends on how their parents and caretakers treated them. Now, in summary, what most of the times happens, and this also results in outcomes like mine, that I face challenges in expressing needs, emotions and boundaries, is directed to not the bad things, the big bad things that happened to the child. This is what most people think about when they hear the term trauma. Well, it's the bad things, the big things they happen. Often it's the good things that didn't happen, that should have, and those things in accumulation cause the wound. Oftentimes this is neglecting certain needs, for example, emotional needs, the need for attention, love, acceptance, being seen, being heard, the freedom to experience all the emotions. And this is what I understand as childhood neglect, especially on an emotional level. Well, but there are other options. Of course, your parents were never there for you. They were always working, never listened to your needs or the things you might want to tell them, or they left you and rejected you entirely. This is also, of course, neglecting, but it's also abandonment. You might be abandoned by them completely, which is a really tough one. Another thing is your parents might be narcissistic or partly narcissistic, show narcissistic behavior or traits, were emotionally abusing you, have seen you as an object of projection of their own needs and emotions and desires. That's obviously emotional abuse to a high degree here, but it's also manipulation. They used you for their needs and desires and manipulated you to fulfill them. And another example is your parents gave you the feeling that you do not deserve to be seen as who you are, and that your needs are bad, that you shouldn't have needs at all. That's obviously oppression here, and you might also suppress some of your needs, desires, and emotions later in life. Now, the potential outcomes are endless, I think, and if you deserved such things in your childhood, it's probably inevitable that you might experience one of these outcomes. I just want to make one thing clear here, and that is that those scenarios, if they happened to a child, then that's the best way for a child to lose their own identity and sense for their own needs and wants. And if you experience such childhoods, then that is the reason why so many of us today experience a ton of symptoms, like some of these, which I tell you now. It's an endless list, but examples are: you feel things that you can't explain as an adult. You can't say no at all, or you always have to justify yourself. So many people have that. You feel needy in your relationship, or even before you enter a relationship, you're craving the other person already. You have social anxieties, or you might appear shy to other people, even if you are not shy when you're on your own. You have an excessive need for attention. You're afraid of loss. You're afraid of commitment. You stay away from relationships entirely, or you stay away from being alone entirely and always have to be within a relationship. You might be procrastinating constantly. You have emotional outbreaks and dysregulation from time to time. You have panic attacks, depression, and many more. The list is technically endless, but it shows how severe the impact of childhood neglect, abuse, and abandonment can be as an adult. Okay, to better understand and categorize these behaviors and flaws we might have, let's look into my favorite paper, Adult Survivors of Childhood Trauma, Complex Trauma, Complex Needs. Here we have 8 big symptoms of complex trauma, and they displayed them in a really nice graphics here. Now, let's just go real quick through these 8 big symptoms here, and then we can categorize all the specific situations we from time to time might experience. Good. We have hypervigilance, which is this super alert mode. You might also know that you might feel observed, that you might also have to scan your environment and be ready to react to a dangerous situation. You might also experience re-experiencing scenarios. Now, hypervigilance as a symptom on its own definitely is related to many aspects, many things we experience in our daily lives. For example, when we suppress specific emotions, when we suppress specific needs because we are afraid what the other person might think of us. When we are hypervigilant, for example, people-pleasing might be part of it. For example, toxic guilt, because as a people-pleaser, you're always super aware what you say and you're afraid to say no. So just saying no at all, just being super aware that you do not say anything wrong in a specific situation where you would normally set a boundary and tell what you need. This is a good example where you are super alert sometime and try to justify yourself, try to protect yourself, scan your environment, and try to not get judged by other people, try to not push other people away. So you're super aware of that. Then we have re-experiencing. This is particularly true if you experience flashbacks, if you experience nightmares, if you have intrusive memories that come up from time to time, specific scenarios that you redream or that you re-experience and relive in your daily life. And what's often happening here is that people misidentify panic attacks with traumatic re-experiencing. When you misidentify those two, then you often think, well, why do I have panic attacks within specific scenarios? Often people can't explain those panic attacks, but often they're triggered by something from their past, and this thing they're triggered by is something they do not know that they get triggered by because they push this memory away. Traumatic re-experiencing is also obviously closely connected to emotional outbreaks, which happen from time to time, also to heavy emotions that appear, for example, within relationships or within a work context, where you just have the feeling of anger from time to time, where you appear aggressive because you know that situation that happened to you before, you're re-experiencing it. And at the same time, you think, well, now I'm adult, I experienced that earlier in life, but you somehow still can't react appropriately from your clear mind, from the part of your brain that is rational and makes a clear decision to be better in that situation. Now you just still react irritated like you would do in the past when you are re-experiencing. Then there is altered attention and consciousness. Is also altered memory. Now, altered attention and memory means when you, for example, have been harmed in the past by your parents and caretakers, let's say from time to time, let's say it happened once a month, then your brain might change these memories to it happened to you constantly all the time. So when you think about your past, you might think someone harmed me constantly. Someone constantly wanted to hurt me and wanted something bad for me. Now, it wasn't actually the truth, but it appeared to you really severe, so your altered attention and consciousness prepares you that you avoid that in the future. And this is why, for example, today you might experience some relationships as threatening, even if there is no threat around, even if the relationship is technically safe, theoretically, but you experience that as a danger because of this altered consciousness and your memories. Next one is emotional dysregulation. Obviously, when you dysregulate within specific trigger states, I made a full episode about that state here. So if you want to deep dive more into emotional dysregulation, definitely watch it. It's also symptomatic of conditions like autism or ADHD. Emotional dysregulation is definitely often experienced within relationships, is often experienced when you are overwhelmed or over-aroused in a daily life situation, is also experienced when you perceive yourself operating as really needy. For example, in the beginning of a relationship, you dysregulate into that needy state and you have a really, really strong desire for attention, for love, and you react intensely emotionally when you don't get that, when the person is not mirroring that state to you. Next one is interpersonal instability. They described it as the difficulty in sustaining relationships and feeling close to others. I think that's also related to a fear of commitment, for example, when you're afraid to commit to a relationship, but also to things like procrastination, when you are afraid, for example, to commit to a job, or when you're afraid to look for a new job, to change a habit, to start over with something. All these things related to procrastination have their origin in this symptom, which is an interpersonal instability, that you actually do not chase what you really want. Let's say you want a new job. Let's say you want to stop eating sugary foods all the time. Let's say you want to move to another city, but you actually procrastinate constantly because you're afraid of that. Then you experience interpersonal instability here. Next symptom is an affected belief system here. That is especially true if you experience toxic guilt, toxic shame around your needs, around specific emotions. For example, when you have, for example, social anxieties because in your head you think, oh, what will the other people think about me? And you might appear shy, you might withdraw when you're with other people, or you stay away from relationships completely because you're afraid of relationships, because you think you're not good enough for another person. This is an affected belief system. You're afraid that other people might judge you, and at some point you are not just seeing that as a wrong behavior, but you abstract that to the level of your identity, and then toxic shame appears within you. And when toxic shame appears within you, you have a distorted sense of identity, and that is definitely an affected core belief system. We also have somatic symptoms. I personally experience them from time to time. When you have pressure in your gut, when you have pressure in your chest, when you have that feeling that your throat is tightening, when you sometimes feel a strong sense of overwhelm and overload, when you start to sweat, those are somatic symptoms that are created within the reaction of your nervous system because you feel unsafe, caused by that wound you had in the past. And when do you experience these somatic symptoms? They often appear within all these examples I told you, starting with you're afraid to say no to other people. Then you have these symptoms of anxiety. You might also experience dissociation, where you just feel like you're in a tunnel, you push everything else away, you feel heavy weight on your shoulder. In situations where you are super needy, for example, you also might have pain in your gut. Let's say the other person is not messaging you back. When you have emotional dysregulation, when you have panic attacks, when you sense a sense of depression, when you feel guilty, when you feel ashamed, all these things might cause somatic symptoms, reactions within your body, because you react intensely to them. And because our body is so closely connected to our minds, because we have a central nervous system that is part of our body and shows us physical signals. And the last one is avoidance. Avoidance is a typical symptom in trauma, in specific situations. For example, when you are afraid of commitment for a relationship, when you stay away from relationships completely, but also when you procrastinate, you find a lot of avoidance because you stay away from, for example, finding a new job. You stay away from too much change, from going to sports, from changing your life. Now, after going through these symptoms, to make that clear, when you have been neglected, abused, or abandoned as a child, you are most probably somewhere on the CPTSD, on the complex post-traumatic stress disorder spectrum, and those common symptoms of it might show up in your life. But what to do if you develop wounds from your childhood and face those different challenges of complex trauma over and over again? We can find the answer already in the headline of the paper, Adult Survivors of Childhood Complex Needs. And most of the times, it's about the needs. And I don't mean that in an egoistic way. Life's not about just recklessly meeting all of your needs. We can postpone, we can find compromises with other people, and we don't have to use or manipulate others to get them met. But still, we have to find ways to bring our needs to light and to meet them in a reasonable setting. Why is that? Because a need that we might feel is something that is required to live as an individual and to have a satisfied life. You can't convince your body and mind that a need is not required or that you don't need to meet them. So there is only one option when it comes to your needs, and that is you have to meet them. That's the only one option you have. So what happens if you push away your needs? If you deny them consciously, what will happen then is that you will meet them unconsciously. For example, say you are with your partner and your partner wants to go to a bar, where this example in the last episode, I think. You don't want to go there, but as you feel guilty saying no, you say yes and accompany them to the bar. If you do this once, it might make you feel uncomfortable, but if you do this every week, this is where you might react irritable or passively aggressive around your partner. In your head, you constantly think, why do I always have to do what you want? Why is it never about me? Sounds familiar? That is why you experienced that as a child, for example. Your needs never have been met, and it was always about the needs, for example, of your narcissistic parent. By the way, you being irritated or passively aggressive in that situation is manipulation from your side then, because you are not aware of your actual need and the urgency to communicate that need or emotion to your partner. Because what you would normally do as an individual who doesn't have this oppression of their needs, you would say, no, honey, I like to stay home today and spend a movie night with you, for example. So interestingly enough, in that specific example, let's say your parent was a narcissist, or your parent emotionally abused you and suppressed your needs and told you that your needs are bad, manipulated you to just care about their needs of the narcissist. And what you do now as an adult is manipulating your partner unconsciously, obviously here, by being passively aggressive or by reacting irritably in those specific situations to make them understand that they did something wrong. Because you are not openly communicating your actual needs and just say, well, I just want to spend a night home with you. Good. To break free from these feelings of guilt around your needs, from these feelings of shame, maybe around your identity, you have to break the cycle we've talked about in that recent episode about the cycle of toxic shame and guilt here. And because if you're able to distinguish true guilt from false guilt, because in a situation where you would say, well, honey, I want to stay home, I just want to watch a movie with you, or I just want to be on my own, that's not a situation where you truly have to feel guilty, but you do. And that is a situation where you would experience false guilt, because you just think that's a bad thing, but it's actually not. And in those situations, you can actually break that cycle and jump over your feelings of guilt and communicate your needs. I know it's pretty hard, it's a pretty tough one, but that's the point in the cycle where it's technically easy to break the cycle. Now, we feel the most guilt and therefore manipulate others the most around those needs that we experience as not okay in our childhood. Okay, one example, let's assume whenever you express the desire to be on your own as a child, Your parents told you that this is not okay and you shouldn't be that egoistic. Why you always have to be with yourself? Why you just care about yourself? Then this might be something in the present where you will struggle a lot with, right? Communicating to a close friend, your partner, family member, I want to be on my own tonight. I don't want to go out with you. That's the tough part. I love you, honey, but I don't want to go out with you tonight, period. But as you don't do that because you feel that guilt, therefore you lie to others and say, I can't come to the party. I just don't want to go out because I have to do work, because I have to do X, Y, Z. But you actually just want to spend time with yourself in that example. So you have another reason you present to them, which is not the actual reason, because the actual reason is you just don't feel like that, but you are not able to tell them that. All right, a helpful exercise to better understand your needs, which can be very complex sometimes, as seen in the title of the paper, is that you can ask yourself, how do I meet my needs at the moment? Especially, you're going to ask yourself that question when you feel safe, when you feel regulated, when you're alone. Right? Let's say you are alone. Ask yourself that question, how do I meet my needs at the moment? How do you do that? Now, most of the people think, well, I don't really know, and I don't even know what my needs actually are. And that's true for me as well sometimes. So there is the nonviolent communication needs list, and that list gives you a great overview about many of our human needs. So I did that research for you and I found this list, and I think it's pretty good. So you can download the full list there as well, including as well what happens, and that's fascinating as well, when you don't meet your needs. So I linked that to you down in the description. And you see also the link as well if you watch this as a video on screen now here. Some of you might also think when it comes to the needs and when you now look at that list, for example, well, some of that needs, those are too childish. I'm now a grown up. I don't want to meet childish needs. So when we sometimes think about needs being too childish, then we have to remind ourselves, if we have been neglected, abused, or abandoned as a child, many needs that have been required may not have been met as a child, so you never matured above this point in your past. So do you still want to suppress those needs still today as an adult and for the rest of your life and suffer from these consequences of oppression? I don't think so, but it's up to you. And to conclude that, everyone on this planet has needs, and when it comes to meeting your needs, and you haven't met them as a child, you have only one single option today, and that is to finally meet your needs. Some final thoughts from my side. I think what is most important when you experienced things like neglection, when you have been abused, experienced abandonment as a child, first of all, to create awareness for all these symptoms you might experience as an adult today, and that those symptoms are related to the wounds of your past, and that they come out of complex trauma. What's also important to understand, and that's a really difficult and tough one, which needs you might actually suppressed for such a long time, and where you're masking, in which areas and around which needs and emotions you hide yourself and you put on that mask because you feel guilty and you might feel judged by other people. Identify those areas slowly and then try to meet your needs. Try to communicate your needs. Try to find compromises with your loved ones. Those are the things that I identified for myself, and also when I do these videos, when I see other people commenting here on YouTube, those are the things that are most important, but at the same time are most hidden under a rock and the least understood ones. Now, if you want to share your story, please do so in the comments below. I always appreciate that. If you want to support this podcast, leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. I want to thank you a lot for watching and listening this episode and my other episodes. I appreciate that this community is growing, and I wish you all the best from the depth of my heart. See and speak to you in the next episode. Have a great day.